he's got to show he's a winner, because actually the whole special operations gig, that propaganda line has worn absolutely thin. Most Russians know that they are at war in Ukraine, and Putin hasn't delivered the knockout blow.
Welcome to another Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, on day 1,253 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, and a day after Trump said he would reduce the time given to Putin to come to the peace table from 50 days to between 10 and 12 days, I don't think he's actually made that formal statement yet. He said he was going to make a statement, but we're very fortunate to be talking to Robert Fox. Now, Robert is the defence editor of the Evening Standard, a commentator in all matters defence, and you've been a journalist for over 54 years now. And you are a foreign commentator and reviewer at the Evening Standard, honorary fellow strategic studies at the Studies Institute at Exeter, associate fellow for the Centre of Defence Studies at KCL, and commentator on foreign affairs and a reporter on all matters related. Welcome back to Frontline.
Hello.
So I'd started off by saying President Trump stated his intent to shorten the 50-day deadline and give Putin to 10 to 12 days. He said he was going to make the formal statement, either last night or today. I haven't heard it as we're recording this. But what do you think that's going to mean in practical terms? And is he serious about it?
I think in his own way, he's quite serious about it, because he doesn't like people like Putin, with whom he thought he had a relationship and a hold even. And the same goes for Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's very important that they now seem to be bracketed in Trump's mind, because he has seen them as people he knew very well on first name terms, with whom he could do deals. Everything is about deals with Trump. Now, we're looking a bit behind the scene, and a deal to be made to work, as Henry Kissinger would have told you, needs miles and miles and miles of staff work and homework. Very interesting account of people who've been involved in that in the New York Times only a few days ago, saying the shuttle diplomacy that Kissinger did after the 73 Yom Kippur War was absolutely exhausting. The effort, for all the reward he got, he put into trying to sweep up after Vietnam, because he knew it was going wrong. The effort that he personally put into getting Mr. Nixon to go to China was enormous. And actually, that is not working with Trump, because Trump has got Fox News performers around him, people like Pete Hegseth, people like the director of intelligence. Yeah. And they all come from Fox News. And he's got Marco Rubio. And Marco Rubio, we're beginning to learn, is not Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo, in the first Trump administration, actually could say, well, boss, have we really thought this one through? And Mike Pompeo did have some successes, particularly Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in which the Abraham Accords were very, very well worked. Now, I suspect that both Netanyahu and, above all, Putin has spotted this, because Putin and his team were told about Trump saying he's going to shorten the deadline. You've got to deliver. You haven't got 50 days to deliver a ceasefire. You've got 10 or 12 days. And they more or less laughed, and they said, well, we haven't been told, and we carry on. And that's what's happening. And I think actually in the Pentagon, in the Pentagon and the State Department, there has to be a reset. And remember, he's got no national security advisor to speak of at the moment. Steve Witkoff isn't a national security advisor. He's a golfing buddy and a dealer. And what happens when they try and get a ceasefire with Hamas? The talks barely go an hour. It's funny, but a lot of the talks barely go an hour, as the talks on a possible Ukraine ceasefire barely went an hour in Istanbul. And Mr. Witkoff goes back to the holiday on, interestingly, the Costa Smeralda in Sardinia. This is not working. And this is where I think we've got to think again. And it's oddly, I think, where the MAGA agenda doesn't work. Make America Great Again, that's neo-isolationism. The neo and the isolationism have really sprung a leak on this. So it's all to play for. Putin is certainly not intimidated by this. Netanyahu knows that he's got to maneuver, but he's not listening to Trump in the way that he did once.
Yeah, yeah, no, the Russian newspapers agree with you. This morning they were saying the ultimatum was not taken seriously, not 50 days, not 10 to 12 days. Moscow has no intention in caving into pressure. But while the Russian newspapers came out with that, Peskov took a more conciliatory tone and said, we've noted it and we're watching it, rather than come out negatively. But all the commentation are commentating around what Trump is doing and what Trump is saying in the press across Moscow is going very anti-Trump, and you're knocking him at every opportunity. Do you think the Russians are actually going to listen to it? Are they going to change their actions on the ground? And if they are, what do you think their reaction is going to be to this?
I think it's pretty clear what the scheme of maneuver, if we can grace it with that, is at the moment, is to push really hard on the central front. 12 glide bombs on Zaporizhia overnight. We're going to have plenty of that. Push on 2 or 3 parts of the central front, which you look at the maps every day, and they're doing it by volume. That the Russian view, frankly, is that quantity has its own quality. So that's happening on the front. And the same thing is happening with the aerial war. What I fear is that if they are persuaded to take Trump seriously and feel they're on a tight deadline, they may switch to real saturation tactics with their mix of drones and ballistic missiles. And I really don't know for how much longer the Ukrainian population and air defenses can take that. The summer offensive is underway. Let's be absolutely clear about that. And it's got to deliver. Now, the political dividend it's got to deliver for Putin is fascinating. And it's a very, very critical thing as how he plays it through to next year. And that's what he's thinking about next year.
Do you think that the Russians are actually going to achieve anything in their summer offensive this year? Because there are reports that, in different areas, they take a village, Ukraine takes the village back. It costs the Russians, 1,000 or thousands of troops a day. It'll be costing the Ukrainians something similar, maybe not quite as many. But, the front line is you're moving Russia's way very, very, very slowly and at a massive cost. At the same time, Russia, when it's attacking with its ballistic missiles and its drones, they're attacking the civilian population, civilian infrastructure. But the Ukrainians are having, they're attacking into military-related or military-associated infrastructure in Russia and are bringing the war to the attention of the Russians. Do you think either side are going to make any real headway?
I don't think they're going to make much headway, and I think that that's going to be a problem. I think the battle would change if, for instance, Germany did permit tourist missiles to be fired. Because if you had tourist missiles, you have that extra range, which could get into the centers where they're producing, particularly, absolutely to name it, the Shahed, the Shahed drones, which Russia is making itself. But I was reading just this morning, Philip, the assessment of the sophisticated stuff in the Russian-made Shaheds, about 90% is Chinese. And this is what they're finding. And this is a new dimension to the game because China cannot play, we will be an honest broker, we're standing to one side. They're not. They're a co-conspirator in combat. They're not necessarily, they're trying every which way not to be seen as a co-combatant, but they are supplying vital ingredients, as indeed is North Korea. This is where Putin, I think, one of the areas in which Putin is weak. If the economy flatlines and goes sour, and this is where there could be effect from secondary sanctions, from them trying to hit the shadow fleets and the energy exports. That's a very important area. And he's short of manpower because we know they've been expanding the breadth of the draft, the twice yearly draft, the autumn and the spring draft. And he's asking allies, under single quotes, in other words, clients in the Central States Treaty Organization, CSTO, can't you conscript to send to my battlefront? That can only go on for a few months. If you'd let me finish by a bit about why next year, it was put to me by a friend, a very eminent a friend who knows the Caucasus, knows the region very well, Domitilla Sagramosa, who teaches at the Department of War Studies in KCL. And she's getting a very strong whiff that they are getting concerned about the election campaign next year, because the Duma is up for election. And if the Duma is up for election, a whole host of regional authorities, mayoralties, municipal authorities, and we know largely it's rubber stamped. But this is the genius of the late, great Alex Navalny. Why did he go east and campaign and campaign? Because it's an opinion poll. And if you get big people at rallies, and that's what Navalny was doing in the month and the year or so before his death, and Putin has got to look good. Sorry, I'll draw it to a conclusion. He's got to show he's a winner, because actually the old special operations gig, that propaganda line, has worn absolutely thin. Most Russians know that they are at war in Ukraine, and Putin hasn't delivered the knockout blow. And he desperately wants to say, I am your victorious leader. I have restored the position of Russia. It will make us great and therefore rich again. We are the dominant strategic power in Europe. It's a big ask. And this is the new way of the game. And it's America becomes less important because it's the assistance Europe gives to Ukraine to keep it in that fight and to put salt on the tail of Putin. But I do think that they will have to be more aggressive about the kind of material that they supplied, because I think there's a chance that the war will proliferate in very subtle ways.
But it's interesting you talk about the impact on the Russian people and the upcoming elections and things, because we had the cyber attack on Aeroflot that caused, or was blamed on a Belarus-based but pro-Ukrainian cyber actors, and brought chaos into a lot of Russian flight schedules. And we get reports of the Russian airports regularly being closed down because of the drone threat that's coming in. And Vladimir Putin cites
Navy Day being cancelled.
I was going to say cites Navy Day being cancelled down because of the drone threats in the airport and security concerns. Do you think that there's a possibility we could see a rise in opposition? Are the Russians concerned about the war coming home, in inverted commas?
Well, that depends on the mothers and widows. It really does, because that was the unknown, and it's a thing that Gorbachev realized was very, very important in the Afghan operation, which lasted 10 years. But the casualty rates were nothing compared to those coming home from Ukraine. So, Philip, I would take the approach that it's bound to have an effect. But we don't quite know how the information channels are going, because, of course, they've been slamming down as much as they possibly can Telegram channels of late. The papers are on the street, but as we're hearing from the reporters on the ground, from things like the Moscow Times, they are talking about the war all the time. And the message that Putin has been saying is that we can manage it. We're under attack. We're under threat. I don't think this is going to work too long. Look at the periphery again, as I was saying. Okay, they seem to have sewn up, weakened the regime and so on in Georgia. But look what's going on in Belarus. There's something very odd going on in Belarus. Lukashenko, who seems to have realized that he's on last knockings, that he's been releasing dissidents, he's been releasing political prisoners, because he knows that he is quite likely, his territory, to be drawn into the Russian sovereign territory for the battle for Ukraine. And that's why we have to look at things like the Baltics. Latvia particularly is vulnerable, But one of the things that was being suggested in the Nordic press by the Swedes, particularly, is that there could be action around the Suwalki Gap, which is that corridor, very thin corridor, just for the viewers and listeners, this strange strategic piece between Lithuania and Poland, which leads to Königsberg. Sorry, I always call it Königsberg. Yeah, which it was in Immanuel Kant's time. You can see where my mind is, but it is that
You're showing your age.
that peculiar bit of guaranteed Russia warm water port on the Baltic. And things are not going well for the Russian Navy. So I see diversions, strange false flag operations cropping up all over the place in the next 6 months.
Yeah. Well, meanwhile, we had a bit of a wobble in Kyiv whenever President Zelensky signed off a change to the laws around the anti-corruption organizations, and then had to very swiftly do a U-turn after there were protests on the streets. Do you think he's managed to put what was potentially a bit of a political disaster, a genie of a political disaster, back into the genie's bottle again?
I don't know why if you could put a half genie back into a half bottle, but it's something like that, isn't it? By the way, this has always been around with Zelensky, and in that respect, he is no different from any Ukrainian leader since independence, because the whiff of corruption has always been around. And by the way, corruption with the oligarchs, and they're still very powerful, is a way of life across that part of the world. And I still think if they want to get Zelensky, finally, the opposition do have that cause, and it's always a cause, as I say, that can be brought up against any leader. They always have buddies. It's always a buddy system which brings you to power. It's a kind of peculiar East European claniste system where you're built on clans. It's the sort of thing that might be familiar, showing my age again, if you went back to before they finally eradicated the bandits in Corsica. I'm not joking, because Corsica's clanism has been a model admired and then disrespected by the likes of Rousseau, Napoleon, you name it, and it is more prevalent, clan politics, across Europe than we give it credit for. But that would bring Zelensky down. Now, what has been interesting is the intervention by a potential successor, whom he parked happily or unhappily away in this capital, London, namely General Zaluzhny. And General Zaluzhny has just given an extremely, he was the former commander-in-chief, replaced by Sirski, sent to London, where he's behaved impeccably and he's much, much respected, his counsels. That being said, he has given a very powerful speech saying he thinks it's time for NATO to get its act together, because he thinks NATO, no more, no less than Russia, is not learning the lessons from the Ukrainian campaign. And he thinks that we've got to, throughout the West, change our whole concept of maneuver, our whole approach to military science, even, because he said that's what the battlefield in Ukraine is really showing us. And one cannot but think, given the parlous state of something like the British Army at the moment, one can't help but think that he's absolutely right.
Oh, of course he's right, and he's got the most experienced military that there is on the European continent. He's in that unique position of having many of his former officers trained in Soviet tactics, techniques, and procedures, but also trained in Western tactics, techniques, and procedures, and bringing together both in a conflict. So, do you think we in the West are actually learning, or are we doing what we always do? Note lessons down in a little book, call them lessons learned, and then wait until we re-identify them again in another 5 years?
Well, there is a handful of people and a few more of the Brits who've been out and training. It's interesting how disappointing, I think, relatively speaking, the infantry training has been here in the UK. We've trained tens of thousands, but the criticism coming back from veterans who come back with new recruits who've been trained in platoon tactics, and the given of the platoon commander's course, how cautious, how risk averse British military doctrine has become. And I do take that on board. But there are people I know who've been out there and really learned the lessons. And somebody who looked at it very closely when he was director of strategy as deputy chief of the defence staff, namely the present commander of the army, General Sir Rowley Walker, a very experienced guerrilla operator, DSO in Afghanistan, and so on. And they really have learned. Now, Rowley's team will tell you the great thing about the Ukrainian military is that it's breaking away, hasn't done it completely, from what you described as standard Soviet military doctrine. And the old fashioned military doctrine is one of the causes at the bottom of this enormous approach to slaughter, getting people slaughtered on the Russian side. What they are worried about, and I think the Ukrainians have learned that it mustn't try then to imitate a medium level NATO army with its NATO doctrines, because they will find it is terribly command heavy. It will be overstructured. Back to the clan warfare kind of thing. I mean, part of the successes is that you've had these brigades, very, very aggressive brigades in the Ukrainian order of battle, of dubious political persuasion, I may say, at some point, particularly, the warriors that came out of Mariupol. But they act as semi-autonomous units. And it's very clever the way that they do, and they're very, very good at their best in sourcing materiel. By that I mean, oh gosh, our frequencies have been compromised. We need to get a different kind of set of drones. They know deep in the rear, and it's very often within Ukraine, not in Poland, not elsewhere and things, that they get the thing fixed. And they have 3D printers that works. They're doing their own logistical chain. Gosh, can you imagine the 13th Bogshirs in the territorial army of the British Army being able to do a logistical innovation of anything? Probably even with a paperclip, they couldn't do it. But the Ukrainians have learned that. And are we learning this new, innovatory, very basic form of warfare, but very postmodern, in that a lot of it's done by robots doing the first contact. A lot of it is based on drones. And therefore, a lot of it, if it even depend on high angle signaling, a lot of it depends on space. Although there was lip service in the recent British Strategic and Defence Review, I didn't get over much real learning of those lessons in the way that the British seem to be thinking.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The risk averse, I get that.
I'm always happy to be very rude with you.
Every unit I commanded, my quartermaster's department was always nicknamed the Aladdin's Cave because we could supply anything to anyone. And I remember my real success was giving paddles for assault boats back to a Royal Engineers unit who couldn't get them. So that was one. But we're looking at different aspects of warfare, and there's a lot of conflicts going on around the world, and the information domain is becoming more and more important. And the link between the information domain and diplomacy, and then the effect that that's having on the front line, again, I think we aren't really learning the lessons of how those all come together. And we look at, into the Middle East in particular, diplomacy seems to be failing at every turn. The Israelis are a perfect example of how you can have what's on paper a very capable, very experienced army, but once they lose the information domain, they've effectively lost the war. What are your thoughts?
Well, you've led me into that. I don't know whether they've lost the information war. They're doing very badly at the moment, both civil and military. It's been so strange that they think that they are getting on top of it, but I have noticed how desperate that they are. There was a very ugly interview with the spokesman, I think, of the government, if not the military, Mr. Mensah, talking to Nick Robinson on the BBC Today programme, and all he could do was to shout at Robinson when he was putting all the various humanitarian evidences about starving and malnutrition, that he was a liar. You're lying. You're lying. This has happened again, by the way, today, from the foreign minister to the international press in Israel. when they were talking about the dire conditions of the civil population of the Gazans, which Trump even has recognized because he's seen it on TV. And I don't say that facetiously. It's when a president sees an image and he believes in it, it is really important. Now, Mr. Katz, who is a highly sophisticated person and a very adroit politician, just didn't seem to get this. And finally, I know it's another channel, but a great friend of mine, Jeremy Bowen, goes in with an airdrop, only 8 tons of humanitarian supplies with a Hercules from the Jordanian Air Force. And he's told by the Israelis, because they're under is very, very tight Israeli control to go into that airspace, that he is to turn his cameras off. He's not allowed to record from the Hercules the vision of the ruined lunar landscape of the northern Gaza Strip. But again, this is a misstep because Jeremy is an extremely eloquent reporter. I don't want to sound condescending because he'll probably kill me for saying it, but he's written 2 very good books. He's a writer, he's a wordsmith, he's a very good wordsmith, and he's given an excoriating description of the landscape of areas in northern Gaza, which he knows very, very well, and I know quite well. And he just said, there is nothing there. There's not even a single person. There is nothing there now. And then when you get Haaretz, free, really one of the most liberal papers and very brave, today is saying that Smotrich and Ben Gvir, as we know, the 2 settler prime representatives in the government, saying, oh, we're going to occupy northern Gaza. Put that with Jeremy Bowen's report. And I'm sorry, I'm being very long-winded and going around the houses, Philip. Are they losing the information war? And information is the 6th dimension of contemporary warfare. Yes, they are.
Oh, I know. I would be bolder and say they have lost the information war, because once you have given the initiative to the other side and they can maintain that initiative, which is what we're seeing with the pro-Palestinian protests on the streets and everything else, you can never wrestle it back again, or it is virtually impossible. And I don't see any way of wrestling it back. But if we look at all of these different factors, from Ukraine and elsewhere, the change in the ultimatum time that Donald Trump's put in, the cyber attacks against the Russians, the political divisions that almost started in Ukraine, but there are between Russia, Belarus, and other parts of the world. What do you think is the greatest single military risk to the UK and the Allies right now? Is it a calculated Russian escalation, miscalculation by the United States, or slow rolling collapse of European unity?
I think it's very simple as far as the British are concerned, and the British are not in the same case as the Allies there. The British government is simply not taking this seriously enough. It's also, we get the accounts, we know what's happened, that there's no extra money for defence. They're not taking it seriously. They spent it on the Chagos Islands, and the mess over getting vulnerable former Afghan supporters or not of British activities in Afghanistan over 12 years back. And we don't seem to have the bandwidth to cope with the new context in which we are emerging. I say this with some feeling because I'm talking to a friend who had a very distinguished military background, who's in Brussels at the moment. He actually lives there, and said the mood in Brussels, whether it's NATO or the EU, apprising people about what is going on as their intelligence analysis as you go further east along what was the old marches of Europe. They are really, really worried indeed. And they're trying to tell the Brits, for example, it does affect you because you're under cyber attack. Your sea lines of communication for food, energy, and communication, telecoms, are very, very vulnerable, and they're being watched and turned over and looked at by the Russians all the time. And they feel that we are an offshore island that has just floated away in its own bubble to some extent. I just want to say that my reading of the week is very peculiar. That I read the memoir and credo of Giorgia Meloni of Italy. Now, there is Italy. I don't agree on many aspects of domestic politics with her, but that's not what we're talking about here. What was so striking is that she is far closer to the street, her street, than almost any other major leader in Western Europe, possibly the Western world. She knows them, she understands the language. She's of deep conviction, and she is deeply cultured. She learnt her English from the lyrics of Michael Jackson, but she quotes Roger Scruton, Edmund Burke, Baudelaire, and Pulp Fiction. She's very well, but she is concentrating on two things. She has two or three things. She's a country saddled with debt on the periphery of Europe that has a major migration issue, which can only be addressed by smart migration, and she has some very good ideas about that, and a declining indigenous population. She recognizes they are in a demographic winter. Offshore, those three characteristics. Oh, so unlike our own dear benighted island. Very similar position, but the address seems to be much more contemporary. She seems to be engaged in a way that I wish the leadership across the whole spectrum of the Palace of Varieties, as Dennis Skinner used to call it, namely the House of Commons in Westminster addresses, but the security, resilience, home and abroad, which they talk so much about. And by the way, the other thing, Philip, don't you love, every time you hear something on defence, security, resilience, and so on, let's have a national conversation. Oh yes, let's, but with whom and about what? I think that's where we are. I think things are going to be really tough when we come back from parliamentary holidays in September and October, and and that's going to affect everything. But Europe, I think, by that time will have had to have moved ahead, because it's got to decide how they can keep Kiev going. By that, sorry, I mean Ukraine and the Ukrainian people going through the winter, because Putin isn't giving up at the moment.
Well, we've seen the success that England can have whenever they've got a European leader on the football field with the ladies. Maybe we should bring in a European leader to lead the country, and Maloney might be a good one. But Robert, it's been fascinating talking to you again for Times Radio Frontline. You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.